Tonight is a workshop that has been a long time in the making with our friends from Fastful. We had the chance over at A Sweat Life to experience Fastful. It is, you'll hear all about it on the team, but it's a delicious bar that sort of takes you from your last meal in the evening all the way to your first meal the next day. Especially great if you're doing intermittent fasting. I'm going to highlight myself. There we go. I think Amanda Hebe's iPhone was spotlighted for some reason. But before we begin, I want everyone to post something to the chat. We at A Sweat Life like to try new things and meet new people. So I want you to post something to the chat. Let's say one thing you have tried in the kitchen in the past month. One new thing you've tried in the kitchen in the past month. It can be a gadget. It can be a recipe. It can be a meal delivery service. It can be a consumer packaged good like a snack or a bar, CPG, if you will. Who you are and one thing you've tried. Ooh, Shayna tried tofu, wasn't? Oh, Shayna. There are some tips to making tofu delicious. I have found. Kelly is a vegetarian. And she probably had. Kelly, you don't eat that much tofu though, do you?
I don't, but I do love it. Maybe, how did you prepare it? It's tricky because it's kind of a weird texture. I like to bake mine.
Yeah. There's also a trick. I'll keep reading these. There's also a trick where you cut it in slices and put pressure on it while it's between some paper towels or towels to get the water out. All right, we've got Olivia tried teaching my grandma how to make a breakfast. Olivia, how'd that go?
She was so excited about it. We put some eggs in it and there was little like sausage and veggies and leftovers from the night before. She was excited.
Oh, amazing. Okay, let's see. We've got Shay. Shay tried Magic Spoon. I have been seeing Magic Spoon in my package room. Was it good? You can come off mute for this too if you want. Or you can just message us. We've got tempeh. It's pronounced tempeh. Wait, Shay, did you say you liked it?
Yeah, I said it was very good. The fruity flavor's the best. The frosted flavor's just okay.
Good to know. Good to know. Chickpea and zucchini curry. Melissa, that sounds wonderful. Sarah made homemade brownies, not from a box. That sounds impossible. I'm proud of you. Shay said it's so good. We've got some more. Noah loves Magic Spoon. We'll have to hear about that. Kathy tried making kale chips. Kathy, how'd that go?
It actually went okay. Some parts of it were too crunchy. I've tried it like 5 years ago. I feel like yeah, this time what I messed up was it should have all been flat and I had some like piled on top of each other. So as you know, yeah.
Hot tip. Yep. Do not pile it up.
Do not pile up kale.
Yeah. And let's see. I don't want to skip anybody, but we've got Ellen, and overnight oats have been for love this month. Ellen, have you tried blending your overnight oats before you soak them?
No, but that sounds amazing.
Yeah. Kelly Levesque has a recipe where you blend it all before you soak it, and the texture is awesome.
Nice. Okay, good to know.
All right. So we're going to ask you to chat with us all evening. We have an expert here with us, Olivia Wagner.
Wait, what?
Oh, I'll mute you. You're not up.
Oh, only.
Thank you. Oh, I got it.
We're good.
We did it. Thank you, Kelly. Olivia is our expert here, and she'll introduce herself in just a second. But first, we want to tell you who this all is brought to you by. It is brought to you by Fastful, which was founded by brothers, Noah and Ben. I'll post a link to the article on A Sweat Life, but we'd love to hear about Fastful before we jump in.
Noah, did you want to go? You want me to go?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. First of all, thank you so much for having us here. Really appreciate it. This is something I've been working on for a while. First thing I just wanted to say is that, Noah and I haven't been fasting forever, but we've been fasting for myself about 1.5 years, Noah about 1 year now, I think. And it's made a huge difference to us. And really, the fasting came first, and then Fastful came shortly after, because it was really, we said we want to bring this to more people, and is there a way to do that? Because really, we had figured out some hacks on how to make fasting easier, and it was really about what do we do to just make it easier so that more people at least try it. Whether or not they, stick with Fastful, for months on end. I mean, obviously that would be great from a business standpoint, but if we can just get people to try it, people that are maybe a little bit hesitant, and they need that, external resource to feel better about it, that's really what we're trying to do with it. And so, if you're wondering what it is, and if you're not familiar, it's pre-fasting nutrition. We've trademarked the idea of pre-fasting nutrition. Surprisingly, no one had thought about it before. Which is kind of hard to believe. Everyone talks about what you're supposed to do during a fast. Sometimes people talk about what you're supposed to do at the end of a fast, but nobody really ever talked about, how do you prepare for a fast? And really, the information is out there. It's readily available. The kind of macronutrients that you need to, indulge in before beginning a fast to give yourself the best opportunity to have a nice, long, smooth one. And really, we just took that learning, put it into a nice, delicious, non-GMO, gluten-free bar with no sugar, and launched about 6 weeks ago. Really launched around New Year's, from the standpoint of marketing, and it's off to the races for us. So again, thank you for having us, and we'll be here for any questions and things like that.
Yeah, we have a special 15% offer for everyone on today's webinar. So if you check us out at fastful.com, you can get 15% off any 12-pack with free shipping. And we also have 4-pack starter packs available with free shipping for $8.95. So we've got 2 delicious flavors available. We've got blueberry muffin, chocolate brownie. I think they taste great. Obviously, I'm biased, but I know that Jenna and Olivia can also tell you how good they taste. So I'll stop and turn it back over to you, Jenna.
Yep. Perfect intro. I figured out how to spotlight more than one person today. So I'm going to unspotlight you. That was really a tech innovation. Next up, we have Olivia Wagner. She is very knowledgeable. She can tell you a little bit about her creds before she jumps into her presentation. I lost her. There you are.
Okay. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for that awesome introduction, Fastful. I agree with you that there's so much to talk about in relationship to fasting, and I think that tonight is a wonderful evening to talk a little bit about it more specifically for women. And so we'll be diving into that today. But first off, I'm Olivia. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist, and I have a private practice called Live Nourish Nutrition, and I help women balance their cycles, improve their energy, eliminate the bloat, and really release that food guilt so that they can build confidence and focus on the things in life that bring them joy and bring them purpose. And I hope that you start to feel, in today, as we're talking about fasting, a little bit more empowered about how you might approach it yourself. All right, so what we'll cover today, we're going to dive a little bit into the history of fasting, some of the science, the types of fasting practices that you're probably hearing most or are most popular today, and also some of the benefits related to different conditions. We're also going to take a look at some of the research regarding women in fasting and how you could start to apply this into your day-to-day life, and some of the things that I've learned through my experience in working with a lot of clients. So I stumbled across this quote and I thought it was really interesting. "The best of all medicines are resting and fasting," by Benjamin Franklin. And I would say that in experience with working with women, I've definitely learned that resting is a huge benefit in women's health. And as I've started to learn a little bit more about fasting and really dive into the available research, I'm starting to feel the same about fasting. And so fasting dates back to as early as 500 BC. And so a lot of the times we were learning that it was used in more religious ways that are actually still even practiced today with the Yom Kippur and Ramadan and Lent. And, as kind of even time has passed, we see that observed too with hunting and gathering, and how there were times where there were cycles of feast and famine, and depending on what time of year it was with crops or what we had available to us in space of, animals and forage. And so there were times where we weren't eating, and there was also a lot of regular movement. You really had to work for your food. And so modern society today has really, really changed a lot of things. We have a widespread of availability of foods with a very, very sedentary lifestyle where most of us are sitting at our screens, as we're doing right now, most of the day. Our entertainment is available 24/7, and really snacking is a huge part of our culture. And so fasting today, you're going to see a lot in our media. Is it a fad, or does it have functional purpose? And so it's been very popularized with the keto diet, the Blueprint juice cleanse, water fasting, and the master cleanse, which is that apple cider vinegar, cayenne, maple syrup combination. And so, is it more than just calorie deficit, or is it just another fad diet? So intermittent fasting is really alternating periods of eating with periods of fasting. There is energy restriction, which is going to be intermittent energy restriction, which looks usually a little bit more broadly to 24-hour increments of fasting at scheduled regular intervals. Maybe it's weekly or it's a couple times a month. And we're going to be digging into a little bit more of those specifications later. And then there's also something called time restricted feeding, which fits under that umbrella of intermittent fasting, which is what we usually talk a little bit more about from like a media perspective too. And this also could be called chrononutrition. And so it refers to the time in which you eat during the day and then the time in which you're fasting outside of it. So this is usually what people are referring to when they say intermittent fasting. All right, so we're going to be digging into what is intermittent fasting, some of the potential benefits, and those fasting practices. I like this visual just because I think it's a really interesting way to see how amazing our body is in this 24-hour clock that we experience each day. So we have this wake feeding cycle, and during that, our body is doing some pretty incredible things. We're seeing that as we're eating food, our pancreas is secreting insulin, and that is helping us take our little sugars from the bloodstream and bring them into the cells for energy. We have an increase in glycogen, so our carbohydrate stores. We're increasing our fat stores, and we aren't doing as much breaking down of anything. We're mostly building things up as we're eating while we're simultaneously going about our day. Then when we sleep at nighttime, that's really where our body has opportunity for a lot of repair and regeneration. We start to tap into with glucagon secretion, we tap into those glycogen stores for that stored energy when we're not eating. We start to see lipid catabolism or breakdown of fats. And when we don't have opportune time for all these important events by fasting in the evening, things get cut short. And so in regard to the potential benefits for fasting, I think the one that we hear about most, especially in our media today, is weight loss and fat loss. And so if we're thinking about that clock again, with the even 12 hours on and 12 hours off, if we're eating at a 14-hour window during the day, we're really cutting back on that opportunity for some of those health benefits that come in the fasting window. And so what sort of impact does fasting have on other conditions outside of weight loss, like cancer, anti-aging and longevity, and blood glucose management and diabetes? Let's take a look. So anti-aging and longevity, most of the research really around this has come down to increased cell regeneration. And so this autophagy is this process by which our body really kind of flushes out debris and repairs these damaged cells and helps improve the mitochondrial or the powerhouse of the cell's health. And so a lot of times we associate a decrease in the cell autophagy to increased aging. And on the other hand, an increase in autophagy tends to lean a little bit more toward anti-aging. And so there has been a number of different research studies that have looked at intermittent fasting and its impact on neuronal autophagy, and so this ability to repair. And something that is interesting to look at is that while we do see this happen in both men and women, there is a little bit more resistance of the female neurons to this autophagy. And we see that with males, this does tend to be a little bit more predominant without resistance. And interestingly enough, as much as I'm saying all these great things about autophagy, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we maybe resisted a little bit, because it's actually a defense mechanism. Our body wants to make sure that it's not killing off healthy cells. And so women can tend to be a little bit less vulnerable to some of these like chronic diseases. But it's something to think about in that anti-aging and longevity picture, and there's definitely more research to be done here. As far as blood glucose and cardiovascular disease, there has been a lot of studies on this as well, and some of the higher claim benefits are increased insulin sensitivity. So in diabetes, the insulin sensitivity is not very good, and with some intermittent fasting studies, we've seen improvements in that response time. We've seen reductions in weight loss, reductions in weight, reductions in fat, improved hemoglobin A1C, so your picture of your blood sugars over a course of 3 months. And we've also seen things related to cardiovascular risk, like reduced inflammation, reduced atherosclerosis, and a lower risk of coronary artery disease, and just in general, better blood sugars after mealtime. So with a little bit more fasting involved, there's been some ability for these mechanisms to work a little bit better. And so one of the important things to know in regard to diabetes and any sort of like kidney condition is that it's really important to work with a healthcare professional, because medications are usually involved and those may need to be adjusted. And it's really essential to be monitoring and maintaining hydration, because things like ketoacidosis or hypoglycemia can occur. And having a healthcare practitioner to work with is going to be a really good fit for you then. Cancer is also another category that's really discussed in space of intermittent fasting. And it was really interesting to dive a little bit deeper into the literature to see some of the positive effects that it can have on chemotherapy and radiation. So actually helping to support some of these treatment measures. It was found that during chemotherapy, fasting was able to activate the oncogenes in the cancer cells to induce that cell autophagy. So that like that cell cleanup. And so disease growth rate and an increased sensitivity to chemotherapy were then observed with that. Also in radiation, we found that there was an improvement in the ability to really dig into increasing the cytotoxic stress and the acute inflammation and the immune response. And we saw that there was an increased recovery of the healthy cells when the intermittent fasting was applied to the radiation practices. And so in addition to fasting having some benefits in the treatment process for cancer, it's also been found to have some improvements or some support in the prevention of cancer too. And so I found these two research studies that I thought were pretty interesting. This first one from 2018 was conducted in Spain, and they had 1,826 men and women participate with prostate and breast cancer, and then 2,000 controls. So about 2,000 of each. And they assessed what times they were eating dinner at. And they found that 35% of those who ate dinner by 9 p.m. had a lower risk, that 35% of those individuals had a lower risk of developing breast or prostate cancer based on comparing those that already had it and those controls. They also looked at the differentiation between what time individuals were eating their meal and what time they were going to bed. And they found that if they had 2 or more hours between finishing dinner and bedtime, there was a 26% lower risk of prostate cancer and a 16% lower risk of breast cancer. And so why the study was looking at those two different cancers, because there's a lot of different ones, is because those are the two cancers that are most common in night shift workers. And night shift workers definitely have some circadian imbalances just because of the nature of their job. And so it was an interesting population that they chose to look at as well in this study. The second one in regard to cancer prevention was a 2016 NHANES study that looked at 2,413 women with breast cancer. And the study outcomes showed that fasting less than 13 hours per night was associated with a 36% increased risk of recurrence of breast cancer. And so something that is definitely worth continuing to explore in this area as a way to support individuals with post-treatment and also prevention in the long run. And so why fasting is honestly such an interesting area of study too is because it's simple, it's flexible, and it's free. I think we are very accustomed in our society today for like a pill for every ill and kind of prescribing and investing a lot of different money into different treatment measures, which can be very, very essential. But it's amazing when we can find a tool that is so natural and innate that doesn't really cost much. It's just a practice. And weight loss and fat loss, like I was talking about before, is the number one reason really people are engaging in fasting right now, at least just as a result of the media. And so some of the claimed benefits of fasting on weight loss and fat loss comes down to the metabolic adaptations that can occur with fasting that favor a loss of fat mass with preservation of lean mass. And so a greater ability to sustain the weight loss because you're losing that fat mass, and the fat mass that is been shown in literature to be at more risk for chronic disease. And so when we fast, our fat cells release fatty acids that are then converted into ketone bodies, which then our body then uses for muscle and neurons. We're basically using fat for energy with prolonged fasts. And so some research also suggests that autophagy on weight loss could have some beneficial effects, and that definitely needs to be still hashed out a little bit more, because there is that kind of like blurred line between the caloric deficit of the fasting window providing, and then also the biochemistry that's going on behind the scenes. And so something else that's worth noting with weight loss and fat loss is that a lot of times when people are engaging in, you know, different practices to lose weight, there's a certain caloric deficit that's put in place, and that can create a certain level of hunger for people. And there's a study that we'll be looking at later on that will be shed a little bit more light on this, but fasting can ultimately provide a little bit more flexibility possibly for someone to see those results without maybe having to adhere to something every single day. So we just talked about some different benefits, but what are the different practices that you could explore to experiment with fasting? So these are 4 of the more popular methods that research is conducted on and also are communicated in the media today. Modified alternate fasting, time-restricted feeding, complete alternate fasting, and the fasting mimicking diet. So those will be the 4 that I'll be speaking to. So the modified alternate fasting is also known as the 5-2 diet. And it's one of the most popular intermittent fasting approaches, and it's in a lot of the research. And what it looks like is 5 days of the week, our participant would engage in what they would like call normal eating or a healthy eating pattern. And then on 2 days of the week that are non-consecutive, they would engage men in a 600 calorie deficit and or 500 calorie deficit max for men and 600 calorie deficit max for women. And so what that kind of looks like here is you would have these 5 days of eating normally, which I would encourage an individual to do like a 12-hour fast on those days. And then on those 2 days that are separate, a lot of times I'll encourage, say, like a Monday or a Thursday, kind of nice to just like break up the week a little bit. You would have maybe an evening meal or a midday meal, achieving that calorie range. Sometimes there will be more of a full like 24-hour thought process where potentially you would like eat your dinner on Sunday night, fast through the morning, fast through the afternoon, and then Monday evening eat your dinner and achieve that 24-hour fast. And this is another kind of option for this modified alternate fasting. And someone who took that kind of thought process and wrote a book and created a little diet around it is Dr. Kellyanne Bertucci, and she her book is called The Bone Broth Diet. And what I find really interesting about this approach is it does follow that kind of 24-hour fasting method here. But during the fasting windows, she encourages you to drink as much bone broth as you would like. And bone broth is kind of a buzzword, and it's very rich in amino acids. They're very nourishing to the gut, specifically an amino acid called glutamine. And each cup of bone broth has about 8 to 12 grams of protein. And if you make it homemade, it will definitely have some fat in it too. And so I think that this is another really interesting intervention to achieve some of the benefits of fasting while also giving your body some nutrition, and for women, helping to keep blood sugar a little bit better stabilized during that window by getting some amino acids in. And so things that she encourages on this approach are to, on the non-fasting days, eat 3 moderate to low carbohydrate, nutrient dense meals, and to focus on including foods that are really nourishing and nutrient rich. And the results that have been communicated through approach like this are fat loss, improvements in cardiovascular risk markers, and general improved energy. So complete alternate fasting focuses a little bit more around 24-hour cyclical fasts. And this might be something used more specifically for a certain health protocol, or a lot of times more I see engaged with men and does really, really well with men. And so I think something to note is like the longer you fast is not always the better, and it's going to be very individualized. And so if we are pushing it too far, which I'll talk about in a little bit too, it actually could backfire a little bit more, and that external stress could encourage a little bit more fat storage in response to maybe a starvation mechanism or that high amount of stress put on the system. But if you are interested in an approach like this or a longer fast, I always recommend starting with a 12-hour and building up 14, 16, 18, 20, 24. And once you get to a full 24-hour or one-day fast, making sure you accomplish 2 non-consecutive 24-hour fasts before moving on to a 48-hour fast, and completing 3 non-consecutive 48-hour fasts before moving on to a 72-hour fast. And so really giving your body some time. And when I say non-consecutive, this wouldn't happen in like 3 weeks time. This might be happening in like 2 months or 3 months time. But some people will participate in more of just this every other day kind of fasting, where it's very, very low calorie on one day, and the following day would be eating a normal diet. So time restricted eating is like what we were talking about with that chrononutrition, what we're exposed to a little bit more in space of the intermittent fasting thought process. And so ad lib energy, so eating what you want during a specific time window, and then having that fasting window with nothing on the outside. And so popular examples would be like the 16-8, so fasting for 16 hours, eating for 8, and that's the lean gains. The 24 is the warrior fast, kind of like touted as that. But honestly, any ratio will work. And as we're talking a little bit more about the application, you'll kind of see how that would fit. But really, a 12-12 and beyond is a pretty sweet spot for starting to see some initial progress. And it's the best place to start. And so this is another one that I see women do really well with, the 14-10. And so here they have it organized as starting your first meal at 10 a.m. and wrapping up by 8 p.m. at night. But this could be shifted in any which way to support your routines. And for a lot of people, I think they like more of like the 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. or even the 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And there are benefits that we'll be talking about to have a little bit more fasting time in the evening. And that was actually showcased in one of those studies earlier, but having the 2 to 3 hours in the evening, or a 3 hour is more recognized as like a flex fast. That can be really beneficial 3 hours before going to sleep in the evening time after your last meal. And so I think that the 10 to 8 is great, but it definitely could be shifted a little bit earlier too. And then the final fasting approach that I wanted to talk to you about is the fasting mimicking diet. And this is something that was brought to light by Dr. Walter Longo, and he's done a lot of research on fasting. And this diet's a little bit special because he actually created a program to help people facilitate it, and that's pretty popular. So you maybe have heard of it, but it's called Prolon, and it's a 5-day meal delivery program that actually gives you these like micro little like snack situations. Like you can see a little picture of it here, but we've got a vegetable soup blend, a little bar, some olives, and these are things that provide you with a little bit of vitamin and mineral and nutrition during the day to actually support some fasting, like some acetyl-L-carnitine and different amino acids to help you through the fasting process. But it's a very low calorie diet for 5 days. And it's meant to be more so done cyclically and not indefinitely. I often will recommend it in practice on a quarterly basis, or if someone is doing a specific protocol, we might do it a little bit more regularly. But I see wonderful results with an approach like this too. So now taking a closer look at some of the research on fasting and women. I'll just preface with, there's not a lot. And this is kind of the way that the research community is. most research studies are created around men, and a lot of them are actually created around collegiate men. And so we have some bias sometimes in our research. And so it's always helpful when we can see some women populations studied. So here was a sample of 107 overweight or obese premenopausal women, so ages 30 to 45, and they were all at risk for breast cancer. And so what they looked at was over a 6-month period, they divided the women's groups to either following a calorie restricted Mediterranean diet or following an intermittent fasting approach, similar to like the 5-2 diet, where they had 75% restriction on 2 consecutive days. So that's the only different thing than like the 5-2 portion. And then they did have them do a recommended kilocalorie amount on the 5 other days for weight maintenance. So the difference between this group and that group is one group had some calorie restriction to more of an extreme, only 2 days of the week, and their other days were pretty standard. And the other group had calorie restriction every day. And they did it so that both groups had 25% energy restriction from estimated needs for the whole week. And so the findings were really interesting because both groups had comparable weight loss and improvements in risk factors for cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, so like insulin, leptin, blood pressure, and inflammatory markers. And so what I thought was cool about this is from this one study, and there definitely needs to continue to be more research, but if someone does have a harder time with having that like, or they don't like to have any sort of like calorie restriction, or they don't feel great about having that in kind of intense plan every single day, to have those 2 days and then be able to eat ad lib on other days could offer some flexibility to achieve similar results. The second study that I came across was one looking at fasting and the female stress response. And so what we saw was in looking at how women responded to a 2-day fasting experiment, that this did not impact their mood or their brain activity or their cognitive or psychomotor function, but it did impact the sympathetic response. And so the parasympathetic response is kind of that rest or digest, and the sympathetic response is that fight or flight. And so can create a little bit more stress, more anxiety, can increase cortisol, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And what is interesting about this was in men, a 2-day fast shifted the nervous system in the other direction, actually more toward the parasympathetic dominance. So they were well rested, they were relaxed, and just as the women, they saw some of those other improvements in other markers, but they saw improvements in the markers where the women didn't really see any changes in them. And so it's interesting to look at the comparison of similar studies with males and females. Another one I wanted to look at was muscle sparing, because that's a regularly talked about benefit in space of weight loss and fat loss. And so this was looking at healthy men and women who are doing moderate intensity cycling, either fasted or fed. So fed would be like if you woke up and you ate a breakfast and exercised, and fasted would be you woke up in the morning and you just went to the gym. And so both men and women displayed greater VO2 max, so it's their oxygen uptake, and resting glycogen concentration in response to the fasted cycling training, but only men showed the greater skeletal muscle adaptations when they were fasted. So it was that they found that the women had better muscle adaptation when they were fed, when they were getting that caloric intake to fuel their activity. I think that this is another like kind of profound example of that there can be differentiations between men and women. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can check in and see like what your body's experiencing. So this doesn't mean that you wouldn't experience some of these benefits that the men had, but there can be differentiations. And so a few other notable findings for women. Women generally just have a greater sensitivity to changes in energy balance. So it has a bigger impact on our hormones. So the hypopituitary gonadal axis, which helps, plays a part with our thyroid and our adrenal glands and our sex hormones. Calorie restriction does have an impact on that, and it can challenge things like fertility and our cycle and energy levels too. And so there was some research that said intermittent fasting may decrease estrogen levels, and decreased estrogen may increase appetite and fat storage. If you're someone who has really high estrogen levels, this actually alternatively could be a benefit to you. We talked a little bit about the sympathetic, parasympathetic already, but just how there was that differentiation between men. And then another study that I found interesting that was a little bit more recent. And the cool thing about these fasting studies is they are pretty recent. I was able to pull mostly things from, 2015 to like 2021 even. So a lot of current research. But there was a interesting study done on polycystic ovarian syndrome, and this protein called kisspeptin, which is produced in the hypothalamus and is important for puberty and for hormone health. And so intermittent fasting was found to decrease kisspeptin in women without PCOS who have normal kisspeptin levels. Fasting might decrease it too much for them. And if it gets too low, it could hypothetically compromise their hormones and their fertility. But in women with PCOS who already have this elevated kisspeptin, the fasting actually might be beneficial to that. And so it could have a regulating effect on the reproductive cycle and can decrease some of the symptoms of PCOS. And so I thought that this was a really applicable study and something to definitely consider if you're someone who does align with more that syndrome. So I've talked about cortisol and the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous response a little bit. So I just wanted to show this picture because we have this normal cortisol curve over the course of the day. And so when we wake up in the morning, our cortisol is higher. And then as we go throughout the day, it starts to dip. And so we can go to sleep. And at the same time, melatonin is doing an inverse curve, and melatonin is increasing when our cortisol is decreasing. But when our body is under perceived stress, whether it's work stress or starvation or exercise or not sleeping enough, this cortisol, this fight or flight hormone, starts to increase. And actually, when cortisol increases, it impacts our fat storage, and we store more fat when we have cortisol. So if you kind of have that abdominal tire, you notice that kind of more fat storage in the abdomen area. A lot of times we call that cortisol belly because it can be more so related to cortisol levels. And this is something that we definitely want to take into consideration with fasting because there's good stress and there's maybe too much stress. And so how can we continue to work to finding that happy balance? And so in summary, fasting may encourage some increased sympathetic activity in women. There's studies generally lacking for women in fasting, so we still need more on it. Not all fasting protocols may have the same benefits for women. And it's important to know that the female hormone cascade can easily be impacted by energy restriction, which is a part of fasting. And so something which can be a part of fasting, not necessarily always, but something for us to definitely keep in mind. So we talked about a lot of information, but what does this mean for you and how could you actually implement this into your life? I always like to say that doctrine creates disconnect. And so if you read something or told something and are determined that it's going to work for your body, but you're getting a lot of signals that it's not, you're probably going to hit a wall at some point. And so making sure that you're turning into your body and really listening to the feedback that you're getting is of greatest importance. And so some possible signs that your body might not be responding very well to fasting could be feeling faint or lightheaded, feeling that you're having to white knuckle your fasts, and that when you maybe do break your fast, you feel kind of off for the rest of the day or get that starving feeling, irregular menstrual cycles or missing periods, sleep dysregulation, anxiety, acne, dry skin, wounds that are slow to heal, weight gain, mood swings, sex drive decreases, and temperature changes would all be things that we would want to watch for and keep an eye on and not necessarily just push through. And so what could be impacting your response to fasting? Why might you be having some more of these symptoms? Well, it could be related to your stress level, that HPA, HPT axis that affects our adrenals and our thyroid. If that's dysregulated, we could have more specific, or we could be more innately impacted by the stress of the fasting. Nutrient deficiencies like chromium, magnesium, if detox pathways need additional support, something to be thinking about too. Vitamin D. Gut health, so bacterial imbalances can actually change the way that we metabolize carbohydrates and impact our blood glucose levels. And so we could see more bouts of hypoglycemia. And also it can really encourage sugar cravings, because if there's bacteria or yeast that's overgrown, that's something that can make it challenging to, have successful fasts. Poor quality or not enough sleep, again, another stressor, and then hormone imbalances that aren't maybe properly being supported. And you might know that if you have really, really significant PMS symptoms, or insomnia, or a lot of like skin, weight, adrenal issues. So what does work, and what would be a really good place to start? My first recommendation is to take inventory of where you currently stand with your meals, your hunger, and your meal times. So are you regularly having snacks? Do you feel satisfied with your meals? Do you feel like you're insatiably hungry all day long? So kind of collecting some data and identifying where you are. And then step 2, trying to build up your main meals to make them a little bit more satisfying. So balancing your plate with proteins, fats, quality carbohydrates, which we'll talk about, and fiber-rich veggies to make that kind of like lovely picture of a nice satiating meal. And starting to practice what that could look like to focus more on your main meals and rely a little bit less on daytime snacking or grazing. And so as you do want to embark on fasting, I always recommend starting with a 12-hour fast. Starting slow and just trying to get into a nice rhythm of like 6 to 6, 7 to 7, 8 to 8 sort of fast. And from there, you can start to build into potentially like a flex fasting sort of picture, which I had mentioned before. And so that would be trying to get a 3-hour fasting window before going to sleep. And so if bedtime's usually 10:30, the hope would be to try to finish by around 7:30 p.m. And so something that I'll regularly observe with individuals when fasting is sometimes they'll start kind of like chasing fasts. And so I like starting people with 12 and kind of shifting from there, because so for example, you were attempting a 14 or 16-hour fast, and you did one and you felt great. And then you got to your evening and you were supposed to start fasting roughly around like 8 or 8:30, but then you got really hungry at 9:30 and you were working on a project and you wanted to do the 16-hour fast again. So all of a sudden the fast gets pushed back an hour, and you start to kind of see it like moving in the toward the evening, and all of a sudden you're eating starting at like 2 p.m. and then you're like up later, and all of a sudden the circadian rhythm is even more disrupted. And so I think getting in a rhythm of like meal times a little bit more focused to the day, and it doesn't mean that you can't eat late at night on occasion, but I think it will work better in general just for a fasting regimen, especially if you're planning on eating more like 2 or 3 meals. And then finally, just giving yourself the grace to have flexibility with fasting. So making sure to listen to your body and also to change up the cadence. I really don't recommend, outside of like a 12-hour fast, committing to the same fast every single day. A 14-hour, some women feel really good with, but in space of like a 16 or 18 or 20, we wouldn't want to be doing those every day. And I think that that could end up ultimately backfiring. And so as you start to get really comfortable with, say, like the 12-hour fast, the flex fasting, I would recommend increasing to like a 14-hour twice a week, and then maybe trying a 15-hour, and then maybe trying a 15 or 16-hour twice a week. And as you start to feel really comfortable, and if you want to try other things on, you might consider a 24-hour fast, like we were talking about, the dinner to dinner, potentially including some bone broth, or I'll share some other options with you during the day. And maybe the rest of the week is 12-hour fasts, or the rest of the week has a couple 14 and some 12s. But giving yourself enough variety and enough of like your foundation too, so that your body's not always being like threatened by this additional stress. And just remembering to progress fasting as your body tolerates it. And if you're getting some of those kickback signals, give yourself some space. So those in general who might not be a very good candidate for fasting would be people who are pregnant, have a history of eating disorders, or have an active eating disorder, as it could be triggering, or chronically stressed, or been diagnosed with adrenal fatigue and are actively working on it. Those who don't sleep well, who are breastfeeding, have uncontrolled diabetes or kidney disease, children who are not yet fully grown, anyone who's underweight or maybe has just been even released from a hospital. It would be important to give your body some time to like rest and recover. Anyone who's just super new to diet modifications and exercise, I would really recommend like laying down the foundations first. And then anyone who's like has miserable period problems and like hormonal symptoms. And just generally, if you're taking medication that requires food, we would want to be a little bit more sensitive to that too. What can you have while you're fasting? A lot of times you'll see this like designated or communicated as clean versus dirty. I think it's either like a classic fast versus a tailored for you fast. As I've read a little bit more into the literature, I'm less convinced that you can't get by with including some of the more tailored for you options, because there is still research to suggest that we see a lot of the same improvements. And so classic fast would be just like liquids that don't have any calories in it whatsoever. Tailored for you, this might just be something to make your life a little bit more flexible, or also work with things that like functionally are supported to you, like apple cider vinegar or electrolytes, branched chain amino acids, sometimes people would do during fast. And then you've probably heard a lot about like bulletproof coffees and including fat with your fasts. I definitely think for women that can be a really productive strategy if, say, maybe you're starting to move up to a 14-hour fast, and a way to help keep your blood sugar a little bit more stabilized with a little fat at the start of the day before you break your fast with your first meal. We just also want to keep in mind that if you're having, 400 calories of fat and then you have 3 meals in the day, it might not support your goals if it's weight loss or fat loss, because we haven't really changed the caloric deficit at all. We are getting some of the fasting, which is great, but the 14 hours might not be enough to see the results that you're then looking for. So what to eat while you're feeding, what to eat in that like window of eating time. I recommend meals balanced with proteins, fats, and fiber, food that sounds good to you most importantly, and focus on main meals as possible. And then if you do need a snack, try to choose one that has some fiber and fat to help keep your blood sugars nice and stable, especially if you were attempting like a 16-hour fast or a little bit of a longer one. I do usually find that people do better with a little bit more protein and fat in their day. And women definitely need those carbohydrates too, the nutrient-dense options, which we'll talk about. But I wrote down some options like nut butter and celery, avocado and everything but the bagel seasoning, and some almonds and blueberries as some more like fiber and fat-rich options. Kind of some of the basics we might be looking for to continue to support some of those goals that are aligned with the fasting would be including anti-inflammatory fats, fresh fruits and veggies. I often recommend, assessing where you're at with your vegetable intake and gradually increasing up to more like 3 to 5 cups a day. Anti-inflammatory fish that are wild caught, fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, organ meats if that's something that you're comfortable with. And then for women specifically, those nutrient-dense carbohydrates like sweet potato, squash, lentils, beans, quinoa, rice is tolerated. Those whole food options are super nourishing, especially at different times of our cycle. And I absolutely think can be still included during fasting protocols. We don't necessarily have to follow a ketogenic diet to get the benefits of fasting in our eating window. And so some other tools to support fasting in the window. I mentioned the branched chain amino acids before. Some people will use this if they're choosing to exercise during fasting. A lot of times when starting to fast, I really recommend being very thoughtful about your exercise regimen, trying to focus a little bit more on like stretching and walking and more gentle movement to get going, and then moving more into strength training, and then moving into a little bit more cardiovascular activity and just having some flexibility, maybe not having your long runs every day on your 16-hour fast. There's definitely benefits to running in a fasted state, and I prefer to run in a fasted state myself, but if that's something your body is not used to doing, you definitely want to ease into that slowly. Acetyl L-carnitine is really a very helpful tool in allowing fatty acids to get into the cell. It basically shuttles them in, and so you can supplement with this during a fasting protocol to assist with the utilization of fats for energy. We heard from wonderful Fastful earlier, and I think that their product is super awesome as an option to include right before you start your fast. So after eating your last meal, having your Fastful bar, and then seeing the benefits of feeling a little bit more sated longer. I know I had one this weekend. They sent me a box, which was really nice to try, and I totally could notice a difference in the morning. And so I think that recognizing how to use that to your benefit on a fasting day, or if you're someone who's used to having like a little dessert after dinner, this could be a really great way to help you kind of kick off your fast. Green tea extract has had some really good research on it in fasting environments and helping with some fat utilization, and so increased fat metabolism. When I say really good research, I mean there's been a couple studies, but it's something that I've seen some good clinical results with too. And then MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides, that's kind of the brain octane oil that they use in the bulletproof coffee, but that helps with the utilization and the availability of ketones. And those ketones are those fatty bodies and it's what our body uses for energy from fat. And so here's a little like morning matcha if you did want to wake up and have something with a little bit of fat in it to start your day before breaking your fast. A teaspoon of matcha, some boiling water, and then a tablespoon of coconut cream or coconut oil, and has a splash of vanilla. Okay, and some barriers to success. So a lot of times what I see people get gunked up with fasting is, like I mentioned earlier before, that fast chasing, starting their fast too late, and then continuing to try to stay on their fasting plan, and they keep pushing it back and pushing it back, and so it becomes this like fast chasing experience, and before they know it, like they're all off their calendar, and so and it's not jiving with their lifestyle either. So I definitely think trying to be really realistic with your expectations for starting, and also if you notice that fast chasing starting, just trying to ease off and eating like ad lib or like as you can for just a few days to what sounds good for you, and then maybe in a week or two restarting with the fasting at like the 12 hours and trying to build back up from there. For some people, and not for everyone, but it's worth sharing because in case this is you, I would like you to know, some people don't feel very good if they fasted for maybe usually like 14 or 16 hours and they break their fast with like a higher carb meal. So some people prefer to break their fast with a meal predominantly focused with protein and fat, like maybe some eggs and avocado and veggies, and like a handful of nuts. But if you were to have, say, like a bowl of oatmeal with some berries and some maple syrup on it, we've got like a carb combination, and not having that protein and fat there, you might find that if you're kind of hungry getting into your eating experience, that then that blood sugar instability might carry more throughout the day, and you might find less satiation, more grazing. And so making sure that there's at least protein and fat at the meal, experimenting if you feel good with having a combination of the carb, fats, and proteins, or if you feel better with just having the proteins, fats, and the veggies. Another barrier, again, having that like doctrine over fasting every single day. And so or creating a plan for yourself and feeling like you need to absolutely stick to it. We definitely want to have some flexibility. We want to have some variation in the different fasting times throughout the week, as we were kind of seeing in those pictures earlier. And so having some openness to that. Dehydration, so not drinking enough water during your fasts, especially if you do, say, a 16, 18, 24-hour fast, there is going to be a little bit more fat breakdown, and we are going to also see likely a little bit of like water loss from the lack of carbohydrate. And so dehydration is definitely something that can kind of lead to that keto flu, if you've heard of that before. And we want to make sure that we have electrolytes available if that's something that you start to experience. And that could be like headaches, dizziness, nausea. Definitely think hydration and electrolytes first. And so a few products I like, E-Light by Body Bio. I like the Noon tablets, and then also the Trace Mineral Drops by Trace Mineral Research. And then just generally working to like salt your food with a Celtic or Himalayan sea salt that's pretty mineral rich, and drinking lots of water during the day, 80 to 100 ounces minimally. So easing into fasting for women, I recommend starting with 12-hour fasts, then seeing how your body feels as you kind of are adjusting to that for a week or two. And then if you feel like ready to bump it up, I would encourage a 14-hour fast. So that could be 7 p.m. to, actually that is meant to say would be 7 p.m. to 9 a.m., sorry. In addition to some 12-hour fasts during the day. And then for the 16-hour fasts, that might be more like a a 7 to 11 window. And that could be something you could try then if you felt comfortable with the 14, bumping up to the 16 twice a week, or doing a couple 14s, a couple 16s, and a couple 12s. So I'm a huge fan of the check-in. I think that as you're trying these experiences, it's really, really important to check in with yourself physically. And so although you might be a little bit, it's normal to feel a little bit uncomfortable with starting fasting, we want to make sure that the hunger is manageable and it's not something that, again, you're white knuckling. And so kind of tuning in, are you noticing the hunger? What is it feeling like? How is your sleep changing? How is your sex drive? How are your energy levels, your exercise performance? Are you finding that it's impacting your mood, or your stress and your work? These are all things that are important, and the fasting is meant to be an assist and support your life as opposed to making it much more complicated or hindering you. And then I think it's also just as important to check in physically as it is to check in mentally. And so are you feeling guilty or ashamed if you break your fast early? Do you feel deprived and then overeat when your eating is allowed? Are you feeling hypercritical in regard to, or like attaching your self-worth to intermittent fasting and how well you're doing with the intermittent fasting? I do see this. And I think that it's very, very normal, especially for women in this time of year too, to try to like latch on to new things that can promise change. And I always say that aggression is not a pathway to healing. And so continuing to give yourself grace and monitor this entire process with curiosity and kindness, and being honest with yourself about how you're feeling is pretty important. And so, you know, if you're feeling really good, if all systems feel like they're a go, I definitely would encourage you to continue with the gentle intermittent fasting approach, and even exploring pushing out that window a little bit. And so something that I think is really interesting is, we have this monthly cycle, and that does impact how we feel. And so we should also think about how our cycle would be impacted by fasting. And so during ovulation and right before you start to menstruate, your body's doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of work. And so I would recommend during this time doing the shorter fasts, because your body might need a little bit more nourishment. It might need a little bit less stress because it's already undergoing a lot of other things. And during this time, you actually might find that it would be harder for you to fast, and you might be having more hunger or feeling like you need more food. So I usually recommend shorter fasts at that time. And then reserving the longer fasting for parts of your menstrual cycle that are a little bit more robust. So actually like the few days into menstruating at the very start of your follicular phase, usually people start to feel pretty good. And then also the 3 days following ovulation. And so I gave you some numbers, but everyone's cycle is going to be pretty different. This is just kind of based on the 1 to 28. And then also just minding your stress buckets. So as I was alluding to before, it's very easy to want to latch onto something that can provide opportunity for change, but we also finding so much stress or putting a lot of stress on your body can actually kind of worsen your opportunity at seeing that change. And so we just definitely want to think about our hormonal health, the amount of stress that's going on in maybe our lives, and knowing that fasting has a lot of benefits, but it also can be a stressor, and just thinking about everything that's coming into that bucket there, you know? And so whether it's the time of your cycle or stress with work, or there's been like a life event with a family member, doing a huge fast during a time of that higher level stress might not be the best fit for you, or adhering to a regular fasting schedule. And so I said, even though many stressors are good for us, like exercise, learning, and change, and they, they only do make us stronger, but only if we give ourselves a chance to recover from it. And so some conclusions here. Intermittent fasting is safe when executed appropriately. It can provide weight loss similar to continuous energy restriction, which are those longer fasts. It may provide more fat loss than continuous energy restriction, and it's also a little bit easier to adhere to. And so that continuous energy restriction, speaking more to like the longer 24-hour fasts. The intermittent fasting in the shorter windows may be easier to stick with long term. And there also is potential benefit to help diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer treatment, and cancer prevention. You know, as we know right now, there's likely multiple mechanisms to the benefits of fasting, and some of those still need to be unearthed. But this still doesn't mean that everyone should fast, and you definitely need to kind of assess that for yourself and where your body's at, and know that this can be very fluid, and it doesn't mean you have to either be on or off fasting. It's something you can just feel free to implement as you feel aligned with. And so some conclusions for women in fasting. Premenopausal and perimenopausal women are more likely to have different experiences with fasting than men do. Women usually do better with shorter and more flexible fasting windows. Keeping an eye out for your symptoms of poor tolerance and including necessary checks and balances to get on track is always, always recommended. Trying to eat a whole food and nourishing diet while fasting always achieves better results. And then also keeping an eye on your stress bucket, what's going in, what's going out. And then in relationship to exercise too, really making sure that as you're starting a new fasting plan, to change your exercise a little bit so that you can adjust to the fasting before building it back up. And keeping an eye on how you feel with your activity level as you're fasting, because exercise is stressor just as fasting is, and we don't want to be overfilling that bucket. So again, to sum it up, step 1, take inventory of your diet, eating times, and symptoms. 2, start building up meals with greater balance to support satiety during the day and less snacking. And then 3, start with a 12-hour daily fast, and then gently start to press until you figure out where your sweet spot is. And so remember to check in for warning signs that may suggest that fasting is working for you or not working for you. It's a thumbs up to listen to your body and to be flexible. It's a thumbs down to force fasting when it doesn't feel good. And so if you are interested in learning a little bit more about women's health and supporting your body, I offer one-on-one coaching programs, and I'll also be launching a group program in February with a bunch of wonderful women already. And so if that's something that you're interested in, definitely reach out to me. And then I would love to open up the floor for questions if anyone has any questions.
Olivia, we've got a question that I can read to you here. We have a question from Melissa. She says, is it okay to drink apple cider vinegar water at 8 a.m., then start intermittent fasting at 10 a.m.?
I would say it's good. I would say if it helps you with your belly and if it's a good start to the day, I definitely think you can include that.
Kate has a question. She already does a 16-hour fast and they work really well as far as her energy goes. Would it be beneficial for her to vary it, to switch between 14, 16, and 12?
Yeah, I think that if right now you're pretty consistent with the 16, I think it's worth checking in to see are you achieving the goals that you want to be achieving with the 16? I think that that's probably like the number one. And if you feel like maybe you're plateauing on some goals, or you're maybe not feeling, or you're noticing like as you're doing a check-in that maybe something isn't feeling as well, it could be worth exploring, like, do you need to cut back a little bit on the fast, or do you feel like stepping up actually to maybe like a 24-hour once a week and doing shorter fasts the rest of the week could be a better fit. I'm a huge fan of just exploration if you're unsure.
Oh, this is awesome. We have a couple more questions. We're going to cut it off in like 3 minutes. I know we went over, but these are—
I'm sorry, I went a little long.
Oh my God, no, these are great questions, and that was good info. From Erin, she wants to know if it's okay to maintain an IF schedule for yourself every day, such as a 14-10 window.
Yes, if it feels good for your body. I think that occasionally giving yourself a break to put in a few 12s there, just to see if you notice any change. It's always nice to kind of like that doctrine creates disconnect statement that I made. If like 14 hours feels amazing for you every day, I'm not going to tell you to stop doing that, but give yourself a little bit of leeway to make sure that that's still what's feeling best.
Awesome. Okay, I'll read these 2 more questions. One from Shay. She wants to know, is there a recommended time of the menstrual cycle to begin experimenting with fasting, or should we just be mindful based on the phase we're in?
So I think that from an individual standpoint, noting when you feel best during the month is probably the best time to experiment. But I had said that like the middle of the follicular phase, so like shortly after you start menstruating and like after you kind of finish, that would be like a time when women usually feel pretty good leading up to ovulation, and then shortly after ovulation.
Love it. Okay, last question is from Amanda, and she wants to know, she starts with a statement and I echo it. She said, I love my glass of wine after a long day. Can I drink wine while fasting?
So wine is going to have the sugar and the carbohydrates that I wouldn't recommend including during a fast, but it's something that you could have prior to starting your fast and still enjoy it on your weeknights.
So you're saying, like, if your last meal, or if you start your fast at 8 p.m., maybe have your dinner and a glass of wine at 7.
Yes, that I mean, you could count the 8 p.m. and beyond as a part of your fast, but what you wouldn't do is sip on the wine from like 8 to 9 to 10 and say you were fasting.
Roger that. Olivia, thank you for all of this incredible information. Ben, Noah, Erin, you guys didn't meet Erin from Fastful, but she's been here and she's been feeding us information too. Thank you so much for everything that brought this night together, and enjoy your last meal of the day.